It's a beautiful night in the hood. It's a beautiful night in the hood. Gonna be hanging out in the hood.
Hi, welcome to Almost Cooperstown.
I'm Mark.
And this is Gordon, and we love talking about baseball.
I want to talk today about overrated and underrated teams. There's been both over the course of the history of baseball, but the best thing to do to start probably would be to define what makes a team, at least as far as we're concerned, what we think makes a team overrated or underrated.
And I think it's hard because in the context of the conversation, you're also kind of talking about the overall place you're trying to put them in, because you could be talking about teams that like all-time teams who's overrated and underrated in the context of who's the greatest of like team or dynasty of all time is different in like who is the greatest team of the 1970s or the best team to never win a World Series. So I think it's interesting in some respects. For me, I think underrated usually goes with, it can't be like there's always the one team that's not really like underrated. Everybody just has them as they're like, oh, well, they're not the classic pick for whatever kind of grouping you're doing. I think for me, the underrated team is the team that's usually like statistically actually way better than people realize. And then it's just they're not talked about because for whatever reason they weren't as interesting a team.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think we'll be, putting out some teams out there to think, wow, I guess they were better than we thought. And we might put some teams out there that like, man, they were in it all the time, but they didn't get over the mountain. So I would add to that, winning more than one World Series, right, is really in a smaller period of time. That means that team, and hopefully it's most of the same players, right? Because what happens is, when you have a great team like the Yankees over the years with 28 World Championships, they have notable periods of excellence where they're winning lots of World Series. The player, they were so good that the players on those teams would change. So you have to sort of era out, okay, what was the DiMaggio era, right? And what was the Mickey Mantle era, and they're not, and the Babe Ruth era, and they're not all concurrent. They're different eras. So they had these protracted periods of excellence with different players in the same franchise. So it really has to be the group of players that were mostly playing together to some degree, or else it's just a franchise.
Right, exactly. And so there is always I think that's the easiest way to kind of look at it. Like in some respects, like I think if you win a World Series, it's hard for you to be overrated as a team because you won a World Series. But I think there's a definitive, like you look at a team being like, if you're talking about a fluke, because you can win a World Series and still have it be kind of a fluky World Series. That like if you played that season out an X number of times, that's probably the only time that particular team wins the World Series.
So I'll start off with one that is a current team that I think, let's say, I don't know if I call them overrated, but they should have won more. That's the Dodgers.
Yeah,
Okay,
I think the Dodgers are a prime example that they've only won one World Series.
Right.
They won it in what people will consider a compromised season. Like, it's not the best look.
Right. So they've averaged 98 wins a year without the COVID season. They had a good season last year. That probably would have translated to something along those lines or better. So, I mean, that's a team of sustained excellence over a 5-year period, if you want to call 16 through last year.
They've been a favorite or the favorite to win the World Series like every one of those years.
They should have won more than one. I think the Dodgers would say that, they were unfairly.
They probably should have won more than
exactly.
one.
We can get into that whole thing.
Now, they would say we definitely should have won more than one, but there was a certain, team that played in Houston that altered the state of that affair.
Okay. But I think you wouldn't right away think of them, but to me, that's like a team that should have won more. And I'd throw in another team in that same decade, not as dramatic because they didn't win any world championships, but the Tigers from 11 to 14 won 4 straight division championships, could never get out of their own way.
No,
it doesn't count. Okay.
But no. I think they're the kind of team where it's just like, outside of having they don't strike me as a team that was like, why didn't they win one nearly as much? Because there was so much elite competition around them. What I do think what's interesting is that at the beginning of the decade, the team that was winning during that time is a team that most accounts people would not say should have won that many World Series in that time frame. And that's the San Francisco Giants winning 3 World Series in that time frame.
3 and 5 years, and and yet you wouldn't have looked at that team as a juggernaut, right? In terms of like they weren't a team that destroyed the competition. They just found ways to win World Series, I think, with a sort of a patched together at times cast that had some great players like Buster Posey and Mad Bum. At the same time, you'd be hard pressed to name 6 or 7 starting players on that team if you don't follow baseball closely.
The thing was is they just pitched really well, and their pitchers got super hot going into the postseason, and they just rode that. And I think it's like the kind of thing where people are like, "Oh, well, they won the World Series." Yeah, but if sometimes the 1% comes up, and that team wins the World Series, and obviously for them it was more than 1% because they kept doing it, but
yes,
it's hard to believe.
Yes, yeah, I think so. They're underrated because they don't have the sort of cachet of being a team that had it.
Nobody
Even
considers them a dynasty. Sir.
No, they weren't. They didn't have a personality, right? That said, we were a great hitting team, we were a great pitching team. They were just a team that won World Series,
a bunch of World Series, yeah,
with essentially the same cast. So okay,
and you know what? Okay, obviously, if we're talking about also, I just thought of this: a team that was obviously way more prolific than what the Tigers did in 11 is the Braves, and their dominance in the NL East throughout the 90s.
So they're on my list. Okay, so from 1995 to 2005, the Braves at that time won 11 straight division crowns. It's hard for a Met fan to say this but you saw it every year. They averaged 97 wins for 11 years.
So that blows the Dodgers out of the water.
And they won 1 World Series.
Not good.
So and they lost, in the World Series to the Yankees. But it just stunned me how they
didn't go again.
Yeah, they couldn't do that. Now, they should have won more. And I'll even go. Here's another team that you don't even think about it that way because they're sort of like the little engine that could all the time with Moneyball approaches and so on and so forth. That's the Oakland A's.
I have a harder time putting I wonder if just because of the perception that people have of them that they were the plucky underdog, so it's almost okay that they never won.
Well, I'll go back further, and let's go back to 1988, which is the year before they won their World Series in '89 with the Bash brothers and whatnot. So 15 playoff appearances in 33 years.
Pretty good.
That's every other year. You think you could have won more than 1 World Series? I don't even think they got to 2 World Series actually, in that period of time.
You would know better than I would.
So all I'm saying is that we give them credit for being the plucky upstart, and yet as a team that, geez, if you're that good in the play, I mean, who wouldn't like to be in the playoffs every other year for 30 years?
You should be able to get 1 or 2 of those over the line.
So I just thought that was interesting that we don't think of them that way. So how about another underrated team?
Oh, go yeah. You have one?
Yeah. And Yankee fans. So before we say that, let's just put the Yankees aside for a second. Okay, because any conversation you have about great all-time teams and years of dominance is got to start with the Yankees, right? From 1920 to 1964, the Yankees had an under 500 season 1 time.
That's pretty good.
1 time they lost more games in 45 years. So when you talk about sustained excellence, you basically have to sort of say, okay, let's put them over here, and maybe we'll do like the greatest, teams of all time kind of a thing, and you'll throw some Cardinal teams in there and so on. So the Yankees are just in another class. So their rival, however, the Red Sox, who as we recount went 0 for most of the 20th century, from 2003 to 2007, won 2 World Series. 94 wins over 5 years per year. I think that was sort of an underrated franchise because just winning the first one just finally made it such that you didn't have to talk about it anymore, and you didn't really think about the franchise.
The pressure was lifted, and I think it's interesting because you get teams that kind of get trapped in that quagmire of oh, they really should have won one, and every time they don't win one and they get close. I wonder what's more pressure for the franchise, a team that's a perennial loser or a team that gets close and just never gets it over the line.
A team that's a perennial loser. So maybe loser is the wrong thing, but a team that doesn't get to the playoffs, that doesn't play in the postseason or even get to a World
Or
Series.
if they do get to the post series, they don't even make it to the championship. They're out in the division or something.
Right, right. I don't mean to pick on a franchise here, but when I looked at it, a franchise that's been around a really long time, right, since 1901, original American League franchise. Just you look through their history, and they never had a sustained period of excellence, and that would be the Chicago White Sox. And it's amazing to me, right? Because well, they don't win World Series very often. They won in '05, but
But they have won one somewhat recently, and
in '05. But before that, it was 1917. Okay, before, and that's
a
that
bit of
not
a
counting
gap.
the Black Sox. And then they didn't go to the World Series for 40 years.
Yeah, that's got to be rough.
So,
But
so I'm just saying this is an original franchise in the American League, and they don't have that. The Pirates also only have little bits, well, in the '70s, the Pirates had 2 World Series winners in 9 years and made the playoffs 6 times. So give them credit. That's a really good decade for the Pirates, and it's a good thing because there aren't any other.
well, yeah, well, like you could talk about the Pirates, but if you really want to talk about a hard up franchise, you kind of have to go to the Seattle Mariners.
Wow. I had them on my list because the 2000 to 2004 Mariners, so that's 5 years,
especially that 2001 team,
right? 98 wins a year. They won one division.
And including a year, and that was the year they went 116
15, yep.
and 46 and were out in 5 games in the ALCS.
I feel bad for the Mariners, and hopefully they're building towards something. Now finally that they've admitted that they're rebuilding. But yeah, they that one spate was their only one, and they're a relatively recent team. That's as close as they've come.
And like it's just that's brutal on some franchises, and I think it's also interesting when you look at like you also have the teams of like I think we could go back and talk about a team that should have won more, and you kind of have to look at that Mets team of the late '80s.
Yep.
Because I know you mentioned that the Oakland Athletics being great in '88, but what about those '88 Mets?
Well, from 85 to 90, the Mets averaged 96 wins a year. And any Met fan will tell you the one World Series just seemed like they kind of had it all, right, in 86 and with the pitching and so on. But a lot of things happened to their players, and some of them were off the field things that impacted their ability to win. And they almost got to the World Series, if not for Mike Socha's home run off Doc Gooden in 1988. And yeah, I would say the Mets to a man would tell you that we should have been in 3 World Series and won a couple of them at least in that 5-year period.
Definitely.
So how about another underrated team? And when you think about the little engines that could, I think about a team like the Minnesota Twins. In the late 80s, from 1987 to 92, they won 2 World Series for a team that, really was not considered a great team. They managed to squeak in there in 87 and 91. They won the World Series, obviously on that great game by Jack Morris in Game 7. I don't think people think of that Twins team as being that good, and I think that they were underrated.
So, I mean, I think it's interesting because you could probably go to the team that's the biggest example of that in some respects, which is that Cardinals team that won the World Series in 06.
Yeah.
They won 83 games that season.
Yeah, and I should have mentioned this before. You're right. 83 games. So up until 1969, and so this, there was just 2 leagues. There were no divisions. So basically, you could have a really good season and finish second, like a bunch of years, and some teams did that, and be thinking that we were the team that could have been had we just been able to get over the top that one year.
Or it's even worse for you, and you're playing in the American League with the Yankees for this whole period of time.
Right.
And they have half of the current Hall of Fame on their roster, and you finish second every year to them.
Right. And so teams would come up and try to, vie for the American League Championship with the Yankees, and obviously most of the time fall short. And they could have been really, really good teams, just not good enough to beat the Yankees. So you had to wait until the Yankees sort of went quiet, like the Orioles did. In the mid 60s, right? The Yankees won their last championship in 1963. let's see, the Dodgers won 63. I think 62 was the last time. And then by the mid 60s, the Yankees weren't any good. And the Orioles won 2 World Series and lost 2 World Series in the period between 1966 and 74. And they had some really great teams.
Yeah, but you wonder how much of that was just they happened to have the good team at the time when the Yankees finally fell off. The Yankees fall off 10 years earlier. Who in the 50s takes over instead?
Right. And there were a bunch of different teams. There was no one team in the American League in the 50s that was the heir apparent to the Yankees. So, you had the White Sox sometime. You had, teams pop up, and, the Red Sox had some good teams, but not one team that's like, oh, man, if we finish second every year. That didn't happen, I believe. So, and you also you can go back to the Phillies. Now there's another team that's been around for forever, but for really, I think, one extended period of excellence. You want to call the 2007 to 11 Phillies when they won the World Series in 09. That was a good Philly team. That was 5 years.
That was a good set of Phillies teams. Yeah.
But I wouldn't say that, that was neither or overrated or underrated. They won their one World Series.
There.
Right.
But one of the good teams of that era.
Maybe some better Philly teams were around in the late 70s. From 76 to 83, the Phillies won 5 division championships, but they only won 1 World Series. This is the Mike Schmidt Phillies, the Steve Carlton Phillies. I don't know. For me, I thought the Phillies should have won more.
I think it's interesting because it's like so many of these teams, when you look at it, really, you look at these teams that like they won one, but you're like, how did you not win more with that collection of players that you had?
Right. I've talked about going to see the Indians play the Braves in the '95 World Series in Cleveland, and the Braves, Glavine pitched a great game, won that World Series at the Braves. The Indians from '95 to 2001 were a top-notch team. I mean, they were in the playoffs every year. They never won a World. Well, they haven't won a World Series since 1948. They never won anything. So that's a team that
especially that '95 team had 6 All-Stars.
Yeah.
Won their division by 30 games. They set a record while 6 players on their team hit over 300, with 5 of them having 20-plus home run seasons. Like,
I can.
Was a really good.
That was a team of mashers. So and yet, whether it was the pitching that fell short or whatever it was, to not even get. Did they get to 1 World Series? Yeah, they lost to the Marlins in '97, but that's the only time they even got to the World Series, much less win one. So I think
'95 they got to the World Series and lost to the
that's right. Obviously, they got the 2 World Series and lost them. Thank you for correcting me. So and I think we talk about a team that also is hard to put into this, like the Yankees. The Dodgers have been around a really long time.
We kind of talked about them a little bit already in terms of the context of their more recent season.
Right. But if you go back to the mid 1940s, from 46 to 56, the Brooklyn Dodgers, this is obviously right before they end up leaving for Los Angeles, they averaged 95 wins a year for 11 years in all 154 game seasons. And that's important, right? Because that 95 wins probably translates to 99 or 100 wins almost a season in 162 games. You take 5% or so, it's going to add, at least 3, 4, or 5 wins to their total. So that's pretty they had just the misfortune of going to the World Series and playing the Yankees every year. And the Yankees were just unbelievable at that time. And so the Dodgers, would lose every year. And where the expression, wait till next year comes from, wasn't from the Dodgers, because they would get to the World Series every year and lose to the Yankees. Finally, in 1955, the Dodgers won their only World Series in Brooklyn.
They right before they left, basically, too.
So they win the World Series in Brooklyn, and in 55 and 56, the Yankees win again. The Dodgers move, and from 1959, the now Los Angeles Dodgers with Sandy Koufax and Don Drysdale, and from 1959 to 66, they win 3 World Series and lose 1 World Series. So 4 World Series. They're just moved to the West Coast. They had a bad first season, and then they were really excellent over the next 8 years. And boy, wouldn't that spoil your fans a little bit? I can see why there's a whole bunch of LA Dodger fans.
Yeah, they show up, they walk into town and immediately start winning. That's going to win you fans.
And another team, and again, I didn't want to talk about the Cardinals other than when I went back and looked at I don't know if you're familiar with the gas house gang expression that
I've heard the name. Wasn't that an athletics team?
No. These are the Cardinals. The Cardinals
Okay, no.
from 1926 to 35. Hornsby. They had just great players. Dizzy Dean. They won 3 World Series and lost 2 World Series in that 10-year period, and averaged 92 wins a year over that 10-year period and 154 games. That was. And they were competing against the Yankees, right? The Yankees won in 27, the Yankees won in 28, the Yankees won in 32. So it was like Yankees or Cardinals for a while in the 20s and the early 30s.
Yeah, well, especially throughout the beginning of baseball, it's usually Yankees and somebody else.
True story. So these are, I think, teams that maybe get a little forgotten when we talk about those Cardinal teams.
And I think that's where some of the underrated comes from.
Yeah.
Is that because they played during these periods of times where one team dominated so much, they get lost in the shuffle of not really getting anointed into their place in history. Like the same way during that time where the Celtics were winning all those championships in basketball,
Right.
there were probably other great teams of that era that just kind of get lost because, well, guess what? You played at the same time as the Celtics.
So I'll read out some record. You tell me, is this team overrated, underrated? Which would you put it? So 96 wins over 11 years in a row, average. 7-time division champions, 2 World Series. What do you think? Overrated? 1970 to 1981. If I tell you the team.
Tell me the team, because it's so hard to tell. It's so hard. I think it is. I don't know if that.
Interesting.
It's like you need to know who it is to know the context of why they would be being considered.
The Cincinnati Reds.
I think that team is probably a little overrated because they have the whole nickname and aura to them, the Big Red Machine.
Huh.
And are they really that notable a team from that era, I guess is the question. I don't know. That also comes from my relative ignorance to their perception to that time. You know what I mean? I don't know what, it wasn't like I'm their contemporary, so I only see them through the historical lens of looking back on them. They might have dominated baseball talk in a lot bigger way, so it makes sense why they were given that kind of nickname.
Well, and that also came out of the fact that the Reds, were the Big Red Machine, right? And they won in 75, and they lost, and they won in 76. So they beat the Red Sox in 75, and they beat the Yankees in 76. And so they had those 2 World Series in the middle of that period of excellence. And so that was a group of guys, winning back-to-back World Series is kind of cool.
It's pretty good. It's hard to see. That's the thing. It's hard to be somebody's overrated when you won back-to-back World Series.
Yeah, so I think they're right on the cusp, right? A little bit.
Right.
I think they should. If you're suggesting they should have won more, you win 96 wins a year for 11 years. You win 7 division championships.
You're a pretty good team. It's hard to really say.
Yeah, you could have thrown another World Series in there. So I'd say they're sort of right, right in the middle. More than any of the others that we discussed. The Athletics, have obviously a long history going back to Philadelphia, and they won 2 World Series in 3 years, and they went to the World Series 3 years in a row from 29 to 31. I don't know how I look at that. Underrated, overrated. A lot of old time baseball fans.
That 31 Athletics team. The thing is that they should have won the World Series,
right?
And they didn't. They had a guy that won the Triple Crown of pitching. They crushed the Yankees, beat them by a ton of games that year. And then they lost in 7 games to the Cardinals that season when they probably shouldn't have. That was such a good team. They'd already won back-to-back World Series. They're almost like, you should have won 3.
and that's maybe why we kind of put out there that those Gas House Gang Cardinal teams that we talked about from 26 to 35, that was the team that beat those 31 Athletics. And they might have been also underrated, because we tend to think that it was the Athletics not winning that series, but the Cardinals.
Instead of the Cardinals winning it. That's a good point.
Right. So I think that's,
I think ultimately at the end of the day, it's just interesting to look at the context of this discussion, because overrated and underrated is as much dependent on, I feel like, who and what teams you're talking about, and the era what the criteria for that discussion is. So at the end of the day, if you're talking about greatest teams of all time, that we go a certain way with that, and you're almost always going to end up with some era of the Yankees teams. But there's a lot of other different discussions.
We'll do an episode on that, but I think we're going to get deep in there. Got to go in the weeds, right, and make sure that there's a, I don't know how we even figure that out, a core group of players, right? That it wasn't a new cast of characters that came
that
in.
was driving their, success.
That it was these guys won, because that's what, to me, it's a great team. If you got a great team and they win, like the Giants, if they would have won in 10 and 12, and then a bunch of new guys came in 14, like the Red Sox, that was kind of like different guys on their World Series.
Yeah, it was two completely different teams.
Right. So I don't think this. So if you're going to talk about greatest teams of all time, it has to have those primary players.
Right. And you're going to have won multiple World Series with the same set of primary players, which there's probably not a lot of teams that have done that.
And I guess the last thing I'll say is that, that whole dividing part of 1969 is important, because without having, just think about no playoffs.
Multiple rounds of playoffs just completely changes things.
Right. It makes it much harder, I think, to be an all-time great team, obviously, when
because you're way less likely.
Gauntlet.
Yeah. You especially because it's much more likely that a team that just has all the best players will be in lots of World Series with the pre-1969 rule, because if you have the best players, you'll be better on average throughout regular seasons. So then you only have to win one playoff series rather than being a team that can win multiple playoff series every year.
And I guess it kind of makes what the Dodgers are doing even a little more impressive now, right? That in this day and age, you can sustain. Now, people will go, yeah, ha. All they need to do is spend a lot of money, which is what they do. But we've seen it plenty of times, and being Met fans,
and they're doing it.
Just spending the money doesn't make it happen.
It also helps that, a lot of the teams in their division have basically been screwing around for the past, 6-7 seasons.
So the teams that haven't, won, World Series, teams like the Padres, teams like the Rays, obviously in recent now, both of those franchises have something to look forward to, getting their first World Series victory, right? The Rays made it to the World Series. The Padres been there a couple of times.
But getting that, because it's like we talked about earlier, it's getting that monkey off your back, like those teams, like the Red Sox when they finally won one, then the Cubs finally won one. It's just like, okay, it's not a thing that pressures the franchise season in, season out.
Yeah, and the Indians since '48 now, I think the longest team without a World Series, and the White Sox only winning in 1917 and 2005.
But at least they got one in 2005.
Yeah, but none of those people can tell you about it because they're not here anymore. So,
thanks for listening. Subscribe to our podcast on your favorite platform,
and you can follow us on Twitter at Almost Coop.